On today's show, we are talking some spring training ball. Finally, talking about the, of course, biggest story. Who is going to be the fifth starter? Matt Waldron potentially impressing, as well as some injury news. Darvish, talking about, we're alluding to potentially retiring early, some potential lineup ideas for opening day, and a whole lot more. Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Padres, your daily San Diego Padres podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Padres podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day for Tuesday, March 4th. As always, I'm your host with sometimes, occasionally, but certainly not always the most, Javier Reyes. You can follow me on Twitter /X and Blue Sky at Javipeno, Javiipeno. Feel free to check me out on there and send me your questions to potentially be featured on the mailbag segment, which is great. We love that, right? Who doesn't love a mailbag segment? It's great every Monday, just like we did yesterday. So if you want your chance, go check that out. Today's episode, guys, though, we are talking some spring training news and notes. I think that it's, again, everything that I'm going to say is kind of something you take with a grain of salt. And it's just, frankly, it's mostly what I like about it is that it's just kind of an excuse to talk about baseball in a lot of ways. So it's an excuse for me to talk about things that will have to do with the regular season as we talk about updates in spring training and whatnot. And we've got a bunch of different notes across the board, whether it be Ethan Salas and De Vries, just some early thoughts on them, just some highlights we've seen of them lately. Just really, really cool stuff for today's show, guys. Let's get super Padre nerdy. But let's start off with a little bit of news. It happened. It's probably the oldest thing that's happened. I did not cover it on the show, but it was discussed recently that there was a stretch fracture injury for reliever Sean Reynolds, as well as Bryan Hoeing, who has a sore right shoulder and has been shut down from his throwing routine so far. This is just a couple of things early on. I think the Sean Reynolds thing is really disappointing. Bryan Hoeing is obviously disappointing too, but I was really hoping maybe Sean Reynolds might have something, because we talked about a lot on the show that in limited time last year, the guy was an absolute freak, striking out basically everybody who showed up to face him. And while I'm not necessarily saying we got ourselves a new Josh Hader or a new prime Mariano Rivera or anything like that, but it was still another depth piece for the bullpen. So hopefully it's not something that's going to take forever. I don't really know, and I don't like projecting injury timetables and all that sort of stuff, but it does hurt a little bit of the Padres' depth heading into opening day. Which is unfortunate, because I really think Reynolds is one of those sneaky guys that us Friar faithful were kind of keeping an eye on. And then Bryan Hoeing, same thing. Bryan Hoeing, while his peripherals were not all that amazing last year, i.e. some suggestions that he pitched a little bit above his head while he was with the Padres, which, don't get me wrong, I'll take it. He was a great acquisition at the time, and he's part of the reason I think potentially that the Padres gave up some top prospects is because they got Bryan Hoeing and they got Tanner Scott in those deals, right? So, but last year, though, his expected ERA was 5.07 compared to 2.18 that he had last year. His FIP was 3.32. So, look, the expected stats can be weird sometimes. I'm not saying that he was secretly a disaster, but even still, Bryan Hoeing, most importantly, was a candidate potentially for that fifth spot. Well, with this injury, I assume that probably takes him out of the running for that. Sorry to him, especially with all the other pitchers from Matt Waldron to Stephen Kolek to Johnny Brito to Randy Vasquez and Kyle Hart, all those guys, that this probably takes him out of the running for that. And, for Padres fans, maybe we've had a couple times in spring training when guys getting hurt have actually resulted in some new players stepping up. Some new player actually becoming the face of the team in some ways. Jake Cronenworth, famously, I believe it was, who was it that was injured? I believe it was Jorge Mateo. I believe he got COVID in 2020, and that's what led the way to Jake Cronenworth making the team, and then being amazing in 2020. He was one of the best players on the team, one of the best second basemen of the entire sport. That was amazing to see. But overall, still, injuries happen. What can I say? But another thing of note that I thought was interesting, Darvish. Let me tell you, Kevin AC wrote an article in the San Diego Union Tribune saying that he's, working hard as he always does, but he did allude to the idea that, will he continue pitching? Because as transcendent, reading from the article, as he might seem, no one knows how long Darvish, who turns 39 in August, will continue pitching. He is signed through 2028, but he conceded one recent morning that there is no guarantee he will pitch another 4 seasons. This is quietly some big news, right? And I do think that it's possible that Darvish is like a really competitive guy, and it would not shock me if he went out and he was like, you know what, I cannot physically pitch, and I don't want to pitch anymore. Now, will that mean that it'll help the Padres in terms of overall salary and stuff like that? I don't know. Frankly, I wouldn't care about that because I love you, Darvish, very, very much. But it's just a little bit of a note, I think. And I also think that it is something that, if you interpret it one way, might be a little bit of a slight on AJ Preller and company, saying like, dang, like, you know, this is a guy who's already talking about like, hey, you know, I don't know for sure if I'm going to be able to pitch 4 more seasons. I mean, we've seen over these past few years that the big thing with him has been health. It's a shame too, but this is what happens when you're at his age, right? And it's not like he was always a bastion of health either, even when he was younger, you Darvish, right? That's always kind of been the thing with him. But even still, I think that it might show you, wow, you signed this guy to another 6 years? Like, that's pretty wild, right? He has failed to reach, 194 innings since signing that extension. Granted, maybe he peaked at that point after that 2022 season, but overall, still love the guy. So hopefully this doesn't happen. And nonetheless, though, you can see it, though. Steadily declining strikeout rate, steadily declining health. He doesn't go maybe necessarily as far into games. We're always wondering when he might end up getting hurt, which stinks because he's so good. And he's one of those guys that, especially last year, he's a guy that in the playoffs you would love to have, because Yu Darvish went out there against the Dodgers and delivered. Yes, he gave up 2 solo shots, but it's also not great when your team is hitting 1, 2, 3 innings the entire time, right? And then you have to just keep going back out there. He showed up in the playoffs last year. He's still a guy that he's almost like at like the, forgive the football analogy, but maybe the Travis Kelce phase of his career, maybe the Tim Duncan phase of his career, where like he's not going to be all that insane in the regular season, barring like some genuinely historic stuff. When you're pitching 160 innings at age 38, and let's say you have like a mid-3s to high-3s ERA, like that's like pretty rare. Like you don't just do that. You know what I'm saying? Especially for a guy like Darvish who's pitched so much. So nonetheless, though, that is something to just keep in the back of your mind going forward. But yeah, that is that, guys. And then lastly, Matt Waldron, my boy, has been impressing so far in spring training. AJ Casfell of MLB.com even tweeted about it. He was the first Padre to work 3 innings in the spring so far. He held the A's scoreless, allowing a hit and a walk while striking out 2, and there's nothing hit hard against him. Hard hit stuff obviously being the biggest thing there. I've been kind of vocal about this. I think that Waldron and Kolek are kind of the 2 guys right now, and then Kyle Hart being the other one. He has yet to pitch, I believe, in the spring thus far. I imagine we will get a Kyle Hart appearance soon, but Matt Waldron so far did impress. And here's the thing. He's pitched so far 5 innings of spring training. He's had 4 strikeouts. He hasn't given up any runs. Casval himself said that the previous outing was solid, and then this one, both him and Stephen Kolek have been turning heads. They've been a little bit of like, dare I say, the front runners in the early going. Although Mike Schilt himself pointed out, he was like, no one's going to win the job this early. We just want to see, get a bunch of people with their feet wet and whatnot. A player like Ryan Bergert as well has been getting a lot of work for the Padres, their number 25 prospect, and also a friend of the show. So I think that overall, the kind of 5th spot is still very, very, very much up for grabs, guys. Shocker. Because we're only like a week into spring training. It's almost like we're not going to know this until opening day. And apparently no idea who the opening day starter is going to be. I think that if Joe Musgrove was healthy, that was the obvious pick that they were going to go with. But without that, I'm like, I don't really know what they're going to do. I actually wouldn't be surprised if it's Michael King. I wouldn't be surprised if it's Cease. And maybe they just want to get Darvish out there because he is a little bit, dare I say, like the heart of that pitching staff currently. This is not a pun on Kyle Hart, but we'll have to see, folks. But we will be talking more about Padres' little spring training notes and doodads as we get through the rest of this podcast. But first, I've realized we've been talking a lot already. Just need a couple seconds to hear a few words from our sponsors. And just like that, everybody, we are back, thriving and vibing here on segment number 2 of the Locked On Padres podcast. Your first listen every day. Free and available on all platforms. And remember to follow me on Twitter /X and Blue Sky at Javapeno, Javiipeno. Continuing on. I mentioned Ryan Bergert. He's just a guy that has been getting a lot of work. I think that suggests that they might like him a little bit. Maybe he's a guy that fills in with these injuries that we've had with both Bryan Hoeing, who's been shut down, and with Sean Reynolds, who had the stress fracture, right? So with that, I think that Ryan Bergert, he was someone that I heard about potentially making the team / making an impact, whatever you want to call it. Last year, I was hearing about this. And granted, part of that was because this was prior to the Padres making the trades for Tanner Scott, making the trades for Bryan Hoeing and Jason Adam, right? So that's a big part of it. But even still, you're going to have to replace these guys at some point, depending on the severity of the injury. So keep an eye out for Ryan Bergert. I don't see anything insane with this guy, but like not necessarily as the high potential as our recent another guest on the show, Tyson Neighbors. Love both of them, but I think Berger could be an interesting little factor. He's actually been up and down, but a little bit with injuries, and I don't know. He's just an interesting little player to keep an eye on. Not necessarily a guy who's going to blow your socks off, but very, very curious to see how that goes. Yuki Matsui, a little bit of update on him. He's thrown 39 pitches this spring so far, 27 of them being strikes. That's good. One of the things about Yuki Matsui has been control. Can he locate his fastball in a way that isn't a liability to the rest of his repertoire, which is quite good? He's been throwing strikes. He's fielded very well. Our guy Tony Gwynn Jr. made a comment on it during the spring training game. Very much love to see that. I'm excited about Yuki Matsui. And apparently, I didn't know this, but from last year, he speaks English and Spanish. I didn't know that. Not like necessarily as fluently, but it's just, man, people are impressive, man. You know what I mean? This is why, like, whenever I'm just amazed at anyone who speaks more than one language. I'm just like, this is amazing. When you speak 3, you're a sicko. I'm not even impressed. I'm just like, this is unfair. What are we doing here? Anyway, shouts to Yuki Matsui. I've talked about him a lot this offseason and how I really think that even if a trade for Robert Suarez were to happen, which as of now, it's still a long shot, but if there was someone to be traded, it seems like from what I've heard personally, and what you guys have probably read as well, he's probably the most likely candidate, that one of the reasons I'm totally open to that is because I think Robert Suarez might have peaked potentially last year. I think he might have a little bit of regression incoming. Fangraphs and their Zips projections certainly think so. And then lastly, because I think a guy like Yuki Matsui is going to be awesome, and I liked past tense now, unfortunately, Sean Reynolds and guys like Alec Jacob and guys like Jeremiah Estrada. Obviously, I think that their bullpen can be really, really good, or at least pretty solid enough to keep them in games, because I really do think Yuki's going to be great this year. And fundamentally, we just love seeing the control, love seeing that for him. More though, guys, let's talk a little bit about Ethan Salas and Leody De Vries, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, yeah. That's right, folks. That's right. We got to talk about these two suckers because they are the ones getting all the headlines. And I did have a bold prediction on this podcast that I thought Ethan Salas would debut at some point in the second half of the season. My reasoning for that, of course, is twofold. One, because he's very talented, and the fact that the Padres are very known for rushing prospects up, right? Like, they've done this before. They brought up C.J. Abrams, in my opinion, clearly too early. The talent's there, but he even looked like a little baby, right? Like, he even looked like he was super young, and they still brought him up anyway, even with the fact that they had Ah-Sung Kim on the team, and he ended up being one of the best players from that season in 2022. I'm not saying that I want Ethan Salas to debut. I still think he's a ways off. But what I love is just everything I'm hearing about him, just all the best stuff. And he even had a defensive highlight throwing out a runner in the spring training over the weekend. That's really good. And I think that is what I mean. I would not be shocked. And Luis Campusano apparently has been a little bit better defensively. He's got a little bit like of a cleaner swing based on just videos and stuff that I've seen multiple sources and whatnot, and multiple people on Twitter from reporters and whatnot post that it just looks like a lot crisper. It doesn't look like, one of the things with his swing is it almost always looked like he threw his entire life force into it. It was a little bit sloppy in some areas, and I think that he made up for that by just having a great second half in 2023 famously. But overall, would love to see that. But if things, let's just pretend things stand true, this is one of the reasons I've been not negative about him, but why I've been talking about the Salas potential is because on top of the Padres being known what they're known for, it wouldn't shock me that they're like, you know what? This kid can at least field really well. And you saw it with the way he's thrown out runners. He looks mature. There's a bunch of stuff you can read out there that they're like, this guy could be special. And if there's one impression that I have for both De Vries and him is that, man, I really don't think Crowder should be trading these guys. I don't know who would be a trade candidate that would make sense for this team. I think that there might be some people who are tempted to give him up, maybe one of them, maybe Salas, because he might be more off, for Luis Robert, right? Because that's a guy who maybe you move into left field and all of a sudden your outfield is fully figured out. But Luis Robert was really, really bad last year. So in my opinion, you don't see too much. Maybe Lars Nootbaar. I don't know if he's a trade candidate, but that's a really solid player that I would love to have on the Padres. Overall, though, I don't see them trading these guys. I think there's a reason why at the trade deadline last year that it was reported that both of them are just completely untouchable. And I think they should be, because all I've seen is positive stuff from these guys. I'm not saying Ethan Salas is Adley Rutschman. I'm not saying he's Ivan Rodriguez, although he has literally gotten that comparison before. But he's definitely an exciting prospect. And when you have an exciting prospect at catcher, when you're the Padres, you hold on to that one, man. Because the last time you guys had an exciting prospect at catcher, you didn't give him enough of a leash, and then you traded him, and he was awesome for a long, long time. Not just with the Dodgers, but also a little bit with the White Sox, too. So, we'll see. Shout out Yasmani Grandal. But yeah, Ethan Salas, man. Leo De Vries, also turning heads big time. There's actually a couple write-ups on him on MILB, just talking about how much he's been flashing so far. Ripping a double on an 0-2 count, the way he fielded a grounder in order to get Mookie Betts, standing, basically on the outfield grass, in the grass area, just standing there, not having to move forward, flinging it over to first base. The athleticism is on display. The glove is on display. We're looking at a 4-tool at minimum type of player here. I don't necessarily know if he's going to be a super duper duper star, but the comparisons feel real, man. And what I love about him so much is, on top of him showing that he stays in there with all the, I sometimes wonder, like, these guys got to know that, they're top level prospects, right? Like, they're being viewed a certain way. They got to know that pressure's on. And for you to stand in there and go up against, big league competition as an 18-year-old and you're down 0-2, what are we used to seeing? Guys get overmatched. And he has looked like that in certain areas, for sure. But for a guy to stand in there and still be able to deliver a hit, usually you get some, like, ridiculous swings because they're just, they're pressing a little bit too hard. They're young, unproven talents in some ways. But Sal's ripping some doubles, getting some big hits on 0-2 counts is what I've been seeing lately, and I think that is very impressive. And just as a reminder, as a 17-year-old, at single A, he finished the year with a 237 batting average, but overall an 803 OPS because he has a great eye at the plate. And, by the way, that was with injuries to both shoulders. Yeah, you guys might forget, but he had, like, big-time injuries. That's one of the reasons that the De Vries hype train has picked up lately, is that he was hurt for a while, right? Like, he had injuries to both shoulders, and he was still able to deliver a good on-base percentage. I'm not saying that, like, is everything. I understand that a 400 on base is not going, that doesn't mean that it's a 400 on base in AAA or let alone the majors, right? But even still, for him to be able to show that and get a little bit of power in there too, and then while the first half early kind of numbers were impacted by that, he finished the regular season in July and August, slashing 284, 407, 589 across 39 games. This guy is a legitimate, really high-level prospect. I would not be surprised. I think Salas fell a little bit in prospect rankings because he was ranked way too high, way too quickly, and that's why he was getting Jason Dominguez comparisons. For those who don't know, Jason Dominguez, a huge, like, kind of peripherals, like, kind of, not even peripherals, but like a, just, not even intangibles, whatever the word is for, like, just his height, his strength, his just the mass, the athletic specimen that he is. And he was way too high on prospect boards. And then what happened? He struggled a little bit in the minors. He's not Mike Trout. You know what I mean? Like, he's not going to come in there and be amazing. Or in the case of the Yankees, he's not Aaron Judge, right? Who was a similar guy who was like, look at this guy. He's huge. He hits for power. Ends up coming to the majors and is awesome, don't get me wrong, and Dominguez we'll see about this year, but I think that's what happened with Salas. De Vries, it's because of injuries, because we didn't get to see it as much, but I really think, and I talked about this on my episode, I think De Vries is going to be like a top 7-5 prospect by the end of the year. I just think that this guy's a stud. I think that his bat speed is amazing. Everything looks good. There's nothing about him that seems like a giant weakness other than the usual stuff of growing pains, and he's still only 18 years old. AJ Preller, please do not trade him. But yeah, that's it for the main prospect checkup, guys. Basically, Ryan Berger, Leo De Vries, and our guy Ethan Salas, probably the main prospects of note thus far. That doesn't mean there's nothing around. But I'm excited. I think that this is really, really exciting. And again, I might be sounding like a biased Padres nerd, but nonetheless, folks, we persevere, we continue onwards into making crazy, outlandish projections, getting our hopes and dreams up here when we're in spring training. But nonetheless, I am still looking to see who that fifth starter is. That is the number one question in terms of what will impact the team right now, but we don't know for sure. But I wanted to talk about the potential lineup for your San Diego Padres heading into opening day, because AJ Cassavell of MLB.com wrote about it. I wanted to give some of my notes on it and just how I'm feeling about it, because it is a lineup that, frankly, I disagree with my guy Michael Bauman on Friday. I think that the Padres lineup, and the D-backs lineup even more so, I think it's okay. I just think that it pales a little bit compared to the Dodgers and the Braves, but like, is it crazy? I don't know, man. I think that there is a world in which these guys ball out, and I think that the bottom of the lineup, you at least have some guys, you have some candidates. As I knock over Tatis, hopefully that's not an omen, guys. But before we talk about all that stuff, just need to take a second to talk about a few words from our sponsors. I'm so bad at doing that transition, my God. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you about the always fantastic friends over at FanDuel, guys. You know what it is, guys, and it is NBA action, NBA season. We're in the midst of it, right? And there's no better place to get in on that action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether I'm backing my team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch 3, I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is real easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. It's great. It's very, very good, guys. And right now, remember, you know, you guys have probably heard this plenty of times, but I'm going to remind you again, because I remind you of good stuff on this podcast. New FanDuel customers, you can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. And just like that, everybody, we are back here on the Locked On Padres podcast, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. One more reminder to go check me out on Twitter/X and Blue Sky at Javipeno, Javiipeno. Let's talk about the lineups and Mr. AJ Cassavell. And we talked about this last year. And I want to talk about AJ Cassavell because last year got a little bit of flack for where he put Jake Cronenworth in the lineup, and it worked well. And basically his reasoning was like, Jake Cronenworth doesn't hit into a lot of double plays, right? And he actually is pretty good at drawing walks. So, you know, mixing up the lineups is important. But I mean by mixing up the lineups is you want to have a nice righty-lefty split. That way, if a team brings out a lefty or a righty on a given day, you're not just getting completely annihilated in certain areas. And when it comes to the lineups that he has suggested in his article, which of course you can check out at MLB.com, his projection versus righties as of right now: Arise, Tatis, Merrill, Machado, Cronenworth, Bogarts, Hayward, Gavin Sheets, DH or tier someone else or another left-handed hitter, and lastly, Elias Diaz at catcher. And then for the lefties, Arise, Tatis, Machado, Merrill, Bogarts, Yuli Gurriel, DH or Eggy Rosario or another right-handed hitter, Cronenworth, Connor Joe in left field, and then Elias Diaz again. So, again, the obvious first things that come to mind are Cronenworth does go down if he's playing against lefties. And here's the thing. Cronenworth is not like incredible against lefties. It's not like that's always ever been a strength of his or anything like that. But I do think that last year was a little bit of an outlier. It was actually weird how bad he was against lefties. And frankly, the entire Padres lineup at one point last year was really struggling against lefties. It was like really, really weird. I don't really understand why that happened. But overall, I don't think that this is a giant issue for Jake Cronenworth. Now, don't get me wrong, last year it wasn't great. Versus lefties, he had a 57 WRC plus, and versus righties, it was 122. But before that, my thing is, there wasn't a giant split. Now, 2023, he was just bad. Lefties 85 WRC plus, righties 94 WRC plus. But then in 2022, it was 108 and 109 respectively, lefties, righties. So I don't think that he's going to be like this liability against lefties. I think he just really struggled last year. Now, granted, he changed a little bit of his tune, right? He changed a little bit of the way he approached the ball, which amounted to more power and a better season, don't get me wrong. So maybe that affected things, and he is struggling against lefties, and maybe the Padres know things we don't know. But we'll see how that breaks down. But when it comes to left field, that's the other thing here. They're probably going to platoon. They're probably going to be using Connor Joe and Jason Hayward. Hayward against righties, Connor Joe against lefties. That part I do agree with. And if they start doing better, I could see a world in which they move up the lineup for sure. And yes, we're wondering, where's Jackson Merrill going to play, right? Like, that is a big, big deal. And I think that Jackson Merrill, speaking of against lefties and whatnot, Merrill is the one that I actually think could become a storyline. His issues hitting both sides, or both throws. Hold on, give me a minute. Both lefties and righties, because last year, this was a guy who, don't get me wrong, was amazing last year. But against lefties, he had an 82 WRC plus, against righties of 147. Now, that isn't as bad as it sounds. Remember, this is a 21-year-old kid. I don't really care if he wasn't immediately great at this specific thing either, right? Like, come on. What else can I ask for from Jackson Merrill? It's okay if he's not amazing against lefties. But given that he's young, I would not be surprised if maybe he struggles a little bit more this year as teams and players and individuals figure out different ways to attack him, especially in the inside corner and the outside corner, like high and inside and high and outside are the two areas where he struggled a little bit, and he chased a lot in those particular places. So we'll have to see, as Michael Bauman wrote about in his article, which everybody should go check out. But the other thing here that I thought was interesting is Luis Arraez, firmly entrenched in the leadoff spot. And that's something I disagree with. I think this is going to happen. That's not why I disagree with it. I disagree with just that it is happening, per se. And the reason for that is because, how do I put this? I just think that overall, I prefer Tatis as the leadoff spot, and there's a few reasons for that. First of all, I like that he has the speed to potentially break up double plays, right? And that's one thing that Arraez does do, is he puts the ball on the ground. And maybe that's why they don't want him leading off. So that's probably the big thing, and probably something that undermines my argument, which is just, well, if Arraez is going to put the ball on the ground, we'd prefer it be before we have, Manny Machado come up, before we have Jackson Merrill come up. We want to have him be the guy who sets the table. But I will point out two things. Number one, Arraez ranked 117th out of 131 batters in pitches per plate appearance last year. And I know what you might be thinking, Mr. Commentator on my channel. No, I'm not hating on Arraez here, because he did have the thumb injury. But even when he didn't, his great season that he had with the Marlins in 2023, he ranked 131 out of 137 in pitches per plate appearance. I don't know. I just feel like I'd like a little bit more from my leadoff hitter in terms of how many pitches they can see. This isn't a dagger or anything like that. Corey Seager ranks low in pitches per plate appearance, right? Because he mashes the crap out of the ball. It's okay. But I'm just saying, overall, it's something to think about. And I actually wouldn't be shocked if at points this year we see Tatis in the leadoff spot, because it is a game flow thing. He had his nearly MVP season in the leadoff spot. He sees more pitches. He's going to see more fastballs. And overall, just get more at-bats, and I think that's awesome. And it's especially awesome when you have a guy like him. You don't want to have him on base, because all of a sudden you're facing Arraez, and you're like, a single could bring Tatis to third. Then I've got to deal with Merrill and Machado. That's pretty rough. But again, it's just my thoughts. I have no issue with them having Arraez hit leadoff. But yeah, we'll have to see, I guess, with the rest of the lineup, I think. But overall, I also think that Eggy Rosario, he should absolutely be hitting against lefties. I don't want to see Yuli Gurriel. I am afraid Yuli Gurriel could become a little bit of a Tyler Wade this year, not in the style of player, but in the nuisance of a player. And here's the thing, I was wrong about Tyler Wade. Once he finally got consistent time, it was like, okay, this is a decent bench player. He's got speed. Love that. He shows up in big moments. Love that. That's awesome. But in general, my thing is Eggy Rosario crushes. And I mean crushes on this side of the platoon. Last year, granted, it wasn't a big amount of time, but against lefties, he had a WRC plus of 182. Righties, he was 23. We don't talk about that, right? He was outrageously good against lefties. So for me, Yuli Gurriel, I don't see any upside there. I would rather put in, if we're going to be starting Eggy Rosario, let's just start him in the right situations. Make it consistent that he's going to hit against lefties. That's what I would rather do, because I think he can crush them. He did crush them last year. And Yuli Gurriel, again, he hasn't been good for a long time. That's why I was a little bit critical of the signing when it first happened, right? Because of the potential Darvish stuff. But it's also like, he had an 83 WRC plus last year, 75 the year before, 85 the year before that. Yeah, he can draw like a decent walk rate every now and then. He did have a walk rate in just 18 games of 13%, but that was just 18 games. You know what I mean? So I don't really see it, especially at his age. I would much rather see Eggy Rosario in that lineup more often. Bogart's batting fifth is interesting. It's going to potentially be a spot for him to maybe drive in some runs when it's against lefties, and then against righties, he's hitting sixth. I'm curious to see how that pans out. But the biggest story, obviously, is Jackson Merrill. He's moving up. And then the other thing is going to be who's going to play in left field, given the splits and all of that. And will one of them stand out more? Jason Hayward has not looked very good in spring training so far. Connor Joe, whatever. Hasn't looked kind of whatever. Tirso and Ellis, he's the guy to keep an eye on as well. He's like a 600 batting average so far. And he's a switch hitter. It's possible that this Jason Hayward, Connor Joe thing is like, yeah, they're just going to play Jason Hayward every now and then because he's a good defensive player, and then Connor Joe might just get waived, or vice versa. That's very much a possibility. Tirso's the number 18 ranked prospect, and my people that follow prospects, my guy Aram Layton's like, you're not asking too much. Can he be a 104 WRC plus guy and not be a defensive liability? That'd be kind of huge for this team, and I think he can do it. I think he can. It's not a guarantee. Right, we've had some guys like this that haven't exactly panned out. I forgot his name from a few years ago, named after like an island. I'm blanking on his name right now. But I'm just saying, Tirso, keep an eye on him for him, especially if he keeps raking the way he does in spring training. They're not going to have much of a choice. I feel like it's going to be Tirso. So those are my thoughts just early so far on the lineup. I think overall what's really cool, though, is that since Jackson Merrill has been such a big plus, and all the additions they've made, it's cool with the switch hitting with Jackson, right? I like that we have a nice balance of the bats, because that was a little bit of a concern heading into last year, so much to the point where Jake Cronenworth was hitting third, right? Like that was a big storyline because they were worried about their matchups and whatnot, but not necessarily the case this year. And yes, both righties and lefties, Elias Diaz being the catcher, unless something happens, unless we hear some big buzz about Luis Campusano, his type of tenure might not be a big deal. We'll have to see, though. And I do want the Padres to commit. And I do want them to play Eggy Rosario over Yuli Gurriel, because I don't want a Tyler Wade situation. I just don't. It would be so maddening. In that case, just leave the guy down, right? I just don't understand that. That was one of my beefs last year, was the usage of Graham Pauley. They used him like once every 7 games. He'd rip a double, and then they keep him out of the lineup the next day. And I'm like, well, then just send him to the minors. What are we doing here? You know, why is Tyler Wade coming up hitting, 190, and he gets to keep playing every day? I don't understand that. Hopefully something like that doesn't necessarily happen again. But what do I know? I'm just an idiot doing a podcast in the library room right now. So, take what I say with a grain of salt, as you should take everything in spring with a grain of salt as well, guys. And with that being said, that about does it for today's edition of the Locked On Padres podcast, the only pod that may be better than the Padres themselves. Remember, subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. You remember, follow me on Twitter/X and Blue Sky at Javipeno, JAVIIPENO. Tomorrow's show is with my guy of Locked On D-backs, Miller Thomas. We're going to be talking about players to keep an eye on for every team, including our own, but also in the National League. Just kind of having a fun general baseball thing. We haven't done that in a while. And of course, talking about the latest buzz, what's going on with both teams, because let me tell you, these two teams might be going to war this year, man. It's going to be great. I can't wait. Can't wait. We're right there. We're right there. It's right there. I need it. I need the nice, delightful, satisfying, when you got the urge snack that is baseball. Not my best analogy. But with that, everybody, stay safe until next time, and stay faithful, my faithful homies. Take care.